Hello, and welcome to Pod4Cure, the podcast brought to you by All4Cure discussing healthcare for patients with myeloma, their caregivers, and everyone in between. Today, I am joined by Jack Aiello, a patient advocate. Hi, Jack. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sarah.
That's excellent. I'm looking forward to learning more about your role as a patient advocate. But before we get into all of that, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm 71 years old. I was born and raised here in the Silicon Valley area, having lived outside of this area for only 5 or 6 years when I was doing graduate studies in Boston. But I've always been here, and I've always worked for the various high-tech companies in the area of marketing. Personally, my next wedding anniversary will be my 50th. I have 3 grown children and 4 fabulous grandkids, 2 of whom are visiting now. So just in case you hear any strange, high-pitched background noises, that's what it will be.
That's excellent. Congratulations on your anniversary. It's so exciting to have family visit now that travel is a little less scary. So, Jack, if you don't mind sharing, what has your myeloma journey looked like up to this point?
So I was diagnosed almost 27 years ago now with myeloma back in 1995. In getting treated, I wanted to find experts in myeloma, and there honestly were limited expertise in the Bay Area where I live. I actually found a local myeloma support group, and that's when I first heard about Little Rock, Arkansas, which back then and even now is a facility that is renowned for supporting myeloma patients. So I traveled there and decided I wanted to have my treatment, my initial treatment there. So in '96, my first major treatment was a tandem autologous transplant. That's when you have 2 auto transplants right in a row. Unfortunately for me, the remission only lasted 1.5 years. I went through a clinical trial for thalidomide, and while it didn't work at all for me, it worked for about 1/3 of the myeloma patients. And so that was the first really important clinical trial in myeloma that led to the development of many, many newer treatments for myeloma that we have today. But as I said, it didn't work for me. I went through other chemotherapy options. Nothing was working. I finally had a 3rd transplant, except this one was a full allogeneic transplant. So in November of '98, I received, after a very high dose of chemotherapy, my sister's stem cells. And ultimately, that put my myeloma in a great remission, to the point where I haven't had any treatment since 2002. Interestingly enough, once my myeloma got into a great response, I had pretty significant side effects from one of the trials, from some radiation, and I had to go on long-term medical disability. And so that was my myeloma treatment story, and my advocacy story kind of started with that medical disability that I had to go on. I have bad neuropathy. I had something called fibrosis from radiation, which is scarring. And so at this point, I can barely walk with even the aid of a cane. And if I'm attending conferences and such, I will use a electric scooter to get around. And so, and being in marketing, we were working trade shows. I got to get up and get around to everybody, and it just wasn't something that I could do as well as I know I should have done.
So you mentioned that was where that big change in your life is what led to your work as a patient advocate. What exactly is a patient advocate, and how did you find out that that was something you could do?
So I think of patient advocacy as having 4 roles, or 4 types of patient advocacy. First of all, there is that focus on the patient. Going to support groups, maybe facilitating the support group over time. There are advocacy organizations that help develop coaches and mentors for myeloma to be contacted and work with other patients. There is the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, who has a wonderful program called First Connection, where you volunteer to speak with patients who request to find someone not only with the same diagnosis, but maybe the same treatment they're about to encounter and such, and want to hear from a patient what at least their experience was. So that's kind of the patient advocacy part of advocacy for me. There is the public policy advocacy. There are, where you typically as a patient are sharing your story with your representatives in DC or state governments who create policies and budgets that affect cancer patients. Much of the funding for clinical trials come from our taxes. And if we can at least focus on getting public policy to expand that budget, then we can hopefully do more and better trials. The third part of advocacy is fundraising. There are a lot of advocacy organizations that depend on revenue, not only from companies, but from individual patients. I make it a point to fundraise nearly every year, and I think it's important, and it's a way to help those organizations provide educational services for patients as well as get into the clinical trial development. And finally, I think the area you're most interested in is research advocacy. The first three types of advocacy I started probably 5 years after my diagnosis. But research advocacy came later for me, starting around 2005, probably. So I've been doing it for 15, 16 years now. And it's an area where you offer your patient perspectives to organizations who are developing clinical trials and want to make sure that they hear from patients in what's important on those trials.
Super interesting. I had no idea that patient advocacy extended even into areas like support groups and fundraising. When I researched in it initially, most of what I saw that came up was, the research side of it. Just looking into your history as well with things like working with the National Cancer Institute and the SWOG Research Institute were big areas of your contribution for patient advocacy. So focusing in on the research side of it, you said that it really goes into making clinical trials the best that they can be for patients. What is your role in aiding that? What are you advising on?
So you have to understand clinical trial design. Clinical trials typically have 3 phases. The first phase is a small group of patients used to test a drug, but they're typically testing for safety and trying to figure out what the right dosage is for those patients. And those trials can be run by a pharma company who's developing the drug, or they can be run by a cancer center like mine at Stanford or UC San Francisco will run phase 1 trials. But as trials get larger, the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, they require more patients. A phase 2 trial is now looking at testing the efficacy of that new drug, as well as side effects. And that probably requires 100 patients. A phase 3 trial will test that new drug against whatever the standard of care is for that patient. And that will require several hundred or even over 1,000 patients. And now you need organizations who have access to large number of patients to be developing those trials. There are different cooperative groups across the country. They go by initials like SWOG or ECOG or a name like Alliance. But these are consortiums that each have hundreds of institutions. When SWOG, let's say, designs a trial, if it gets out there and such, it's these hundreds of institutions who have a number of patients each that can be part of that trial, and they can accrue those even 1,000 patients that are needed. The clinical trial itself starts off typically as a concept proposed by a principal investigator, a myeloma expert doctor. And that concept is just a 2-page write-up of what they are thinking of in terms of the importance of, can we turn this into a trial? They'll end up presenting maybe now a 10-page document if that concept is approved internally by SWOG. They'll present that document to NCI, the National Cancer Institute, for either their approval or their recommendation for changes to ultimately approve it. And if it's approved by NCI, it goes back to SWOG. For now, a protocol gets developed, and that's where they dot all the I's and cross all the T's and end up with a 125-page document to answer every question possible about that trial for the physician to be able to execute that trial. That's where an informed consent that the patient will sign off on who wants to enter the trial gets written. From a research advocate standpoint, I'm fortunate enough to be able to add a patient's perspective in all of those different areas of development. From a concept standpoint, how important is that trial idea to the patient? What are the risk rewards in terms of maybe getting into that trial? From a protocol standpoint, what about those eligibility criteria that need to be written, both for eligible and ineligible patients? If you have HIV, for example, why should you be ineligible for a cancer trial? And yet you'll see that on some ineligible criteria. And those are questions I, as a patient advocate, can ask. From a informed consent standpoint, how readable is that informed consent? You see a lot of legalese and some of the language is required, but at the same time, the English can usually be simplified and offered to the patient so that it's a little bit more readable, and maybe even a 1 or 2-page summary can be written by a patient to help prospective patients understand that trial. From an accrual standpoint, what about accruing a diverse population? It's well known that for myeloma, for example, African Americans have a 50% higher chance of getting myeloma than Caucasians. So is that reflected in the accrual, this diversity? Because we certainly want to have fair representation, if you will, from the various diverse audiences. So my job, as I say, as a research advocate, is to look across the development cycle of a trial and be able to offer a patient's perspective and ask questions so that hopefully that trial is successful, it accrues successfully, the results are important to patients, and it's a win-win for everyone involved.
That is super fascinating. And it's actually encouraging to hear that these huge institutes do rely on patients to, make it more acceptable, and really trying to put the patient first, even though sometimes that can get lost in just all of the different phases of planning. Has your marketing background really lent itself to this type of work? I mean, as somebody who works in marketing myself, I feel like your skills really lend well to that.
Yeah, I think so. I think in marketing, you have to be a good listener, and then you have to ask good questions. It's interesting. I think the most important part for a research advocate is to make sure they stay educated in their disease and the various treatments available to treat their disease. But you also have to realize you'll never know the science as well as the principal investigator and all the other doctors you're dealing with in developing this trial. So it really comes down to doing your homework and then asking good questions. I think, at least for me, and I know other advocates have gone through this, it can be intimidating. You're not the scientist of the group, you're the patient, but you're dealing with scientists. And yet all the doctors I've worked with have been very complimentary to me personally, and always want that patient perspective. I'm a good listener, so sometimes I'm silent, and because I don't have anything I think to add to what's being said. But they will pick on me and ask me, what is my opinion of a certain subject matter? And I'll certainly offer it because they want that patient perspective.
For you, despite kind of the intimidating challenges or being up against a huge board of scientists or researchers, what is the most rewarding aspect of this work for you?
So I really appreciate the relationships that I've made with these various doctors. I consider many of them friends. I will these days ask them if they'd like to speak to our support group at one of our meetings, and I've always received yes answers. I personally can email them anytime with a question and I'll get a reply. So I really enjoy working with the doctors that I work with. And then, of course, it's rewarding to give back to patients. It's a pay it forward type thing. There were patients before me who were involved with this, and I appreciated what they did and benefited from their work. And I'm told today by various patients that they think the same of me. So there are a lot of benefits to doing it, and it keeps me busy. That's for sure.
It sounds like it for sure. I mean, even on top of that, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you are the facilitator, correct, of the San Francisco Bay Area Multiple Myeloma Support Group?
Correct.
Does your work as a patient advocate, does that ever bleed into your role as a facilitator? I mean, you mentioned that sometimes you can get doctors to come and speak, but how do those roles kind of complement each other?
Well, you remember I start off by saying the role of the research advocate is to provide patients' perspectives. Our support group meets monthly with 50 to 75 myeloma patients and caregivers who are all about offering their perspectives and asking questions. What's important for them to understand? And maybe it's a doctor that I invite to help answer those questions, but maybe it's those questions that get integrated into a future clinical trial in terms of at least how important is that trial to the patient? Or on the other hand, how much do patients hate getting bone marrow biopsies and would rather see the results tested by a blood draw rather than putting a needle in your hip? So, they fill me all the time with the perspectives that are available from these patients, as well as others that I communicate with across the country.
That's awesome. I mean, the work that you do for myeloma patients is, leaps and bounds. I'm really glad that you're able to get those perspectives all around. But do you have any final advice for patients who are either considering becoming advocates or even just your general myeloma advice?
So I said that there were 4 areas of advocacy: patient, public policy, fundraising, and research. Pick one or all 4 of those areas if you're interested in that. You have to get educated about your disease, especially for the research advocacy role, and contact one of the many advocacy organizations out there that support your disease. Offer to volunteer. I mean, that's actually how I got started. There's the International Myeloma Foundation, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, Patient Power, Myeloma Crowd, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Patient Empower Network, Pod4Cure, and more. They are all appreciative of anyone that might help volunteer. And it's a way to learn a little bit more about what goes on behind the scenes. And if you express an interest to be involved, let's say in fundraising, I know they can help you do that. Or if you express an interest to either become part of a support group or start a support group if there isn't one in your area, they can help with that. Patients can check out Facebook groups and Twitter. You'd be amazed at how many of the myeloma expert physicians have Twitter accounts and offer their opinions on various treatment options or the importance of meetings that just took place and what came out of those meetings. You need to be proactive, but there are certainly opportunities for patients and caregivers to become more involved in advocacy.
I think that's a really good advice. I'm hoping that it gets to the people that need to hear it.
Me too.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jack, for sitting down and talking with me today. I feel like I learned an immense amount about not only what you do, but just how clinical trials, work to help patients.
I enjoyed talking with you, Sarah. It's always nice to share what advocates do. And I've met so many folks that advocate across different disease forms and such. So, and they're really, really bright people who are focused on doing better for other patients. So it's a good group to be part of.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a really wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of Pod4Cure. If you or someone you know has multiple myeloma and would like to register with All4Cure for free, you can visit all4cure.com.